We don't like to think about it. We can't stop thinking about it. It shapes the way many people live their lives. But what about after you die? What becomes of you then? And what if you have a bit of a bone to pick with the living? Today on Morbid Mysteries and Histories, starving bones and their sad stories. Across time and across cultures, we have wondered and speculated about what happens after we die. It's something that affects all of us. It's probably the greatest unknown, and anyone who does solve the mystery never lives to tell the tale. And of course, with it being so universal across time and space, there's a lot of differences in the speculation and myths and traditions surrounding death and the afterlife. But there are a few common themes. A lot of cultures share things like there being a good and bad afterlife or next life, and having some kind of figure that's kind of the judge of that, whether you were good enough, as well as having some tradition of a specific way to bury or burn the body in order to honor the dead, sometimes this even giving them a better afterlife, as well as the belief in some form of the dead lingering among the living. And now I could try and dig into the reasons in psychology as to why all of those similarities exist independent of each other, but there is one running theme that I specifically want to focus on today. I already kind of mentioned it. It's the need for a proper burial, and specifically, if you don't get one, then your ghost, spirit, physical bones, or body itself will become lost or hungry or even vengeful. It's especially prominent in certain East Asian cultures, and as we all know, every Asian culture is basically the same, right? It's a different day. That's why the lighting changed. 'Cause I'm bad at time management. So before I get into actually talking about the things, since this is an episode all about Asian mythology, I want to first say that I am notoriously bad at pronouncing things. So despite making my best efforts to figure it all out, I will get things wrong, and feel free to correct me in the comments below. It helps me learn something and boost the engagement. Thanks. So, having said that, let's get into the meat of it, or lack thereof. So there's an important tradition in China known as the Procession of the Dead. It was said that on certain nights, at the dead of night, the darkest hours when almost everyone was safe tucked up in their homes, you would start to hear a gong come from the distance. In a slow, steady rhythm, it would start faint as the sound reverberated through the air and echoed in the night, but would gradually grow closer. Everyone knew what this gong meant at this hour, and therefore, those who were smart would hide. As the gong grew louder, those still watching could see some shuffling figures in the distance. As those figures grew closer, along with the beating gong, people could hear the sound of feet dragging in the dirt, and a metallic scraping almost. At that point, it wouldn't be long until those figures emerged from the fog and the dark and revealed themselves to be a priest. Behind him, a line of corpses, standing and walking, their footsteps in time with that beating gong, their faces covered with white cloths. Many who were still awake wanted to get a glimpse at these walking corpses, but they knew better not to look too closely, lest you be at risk for one of them attaching to you, maybe even trying to steal your life force away. Eventually, as everyone watched, crouched in their windows, the procession would slowly shuffle its way through the village and out back into the empty night, the gong fading away. Now this sounds like complete legend, but it's not. It's a thing that really happened, recently enough that it's still in some people's living memory. So what really was the Procession of the Dead? Did these people really witness walking corpses? Well, kind of. See, it all really comes down to one thing. the legend that these corpses could steal your life force if you looked at them too long. This was exactly what they needed to get people to look away and pull off a wonderful magic trick. It was all done by a couple of Taoist priests, or people who could convince people they were Taoist priests at least, to begin the ritual. One of these priests would pray over the corpses and begin the possession, so it's called. That line of corpses was then tied to 2 bamboo poles, which would be lifted up to suspend them to look as if they were standing. The ends of the bamboo poles would be placed on the shoulders of a priest in front and priest in back, with all of the corpses in line between them. Like when you had the line leader and caboose in grade school, but a lot darker. The priest would take steps to the beat of that gong, and each time they took a step, because of the bamboo poles suspending them, it looked like the corpses took a step as well. All of this was done because of the significant belief that it's very important to be buried in one's home soil. If you are, then your friends and family and loved ones from life can feed and nourish your ghost. If you aren't, then your ghost will be wandering eternity, homeless, starving, and lost and alone. Which, doesn't sound like a very appealing afterlife for most people. But what about people who traveled for work or whatever other reason that led them to dying far away from home? They still wanted to be buried in their home soil, but in order to do that, they had to get there. And for most of history, and still today, transporting a whole corpse long distances is not cheap or easy. So this procession of the dead was all part of the ritual to get the dead back home. So what happens if you can't get back home? What terrible fate will befall you? Well, to explore those many stories, let's hop over to our Masters of Horror, Japan. Look, I'm just saying that I think Japanese horror is on another level. There is something special going on there. And that applies to yokai too. Yokai being kind of mythical beings in Japanese folklore, but even that isn't really a perfect definition of them. There's really no direct translation or definition of a yokai in English. You can say that they're demons, monsters, ghosts, even cryptids, but they're kind of all of these things and none of these things and more. Even within Japanese folklore, there's disagreements on what is and isn't a yokai. What creatures count as yokai? Are they good, evil, neither? Does this only apply to Japanese creatures, or could it be supernatural beings from all over the world? That's really the best parallel I can draw to it, I think, is that they are just some vague definition of supernatural beings and legends. But regardless of what they're defined as, they have a very long history in Japan and are still very loved today by many people in Japan, outside of Japan, and me. I don't know, they're just such weird, interesting little guys. There's not anything else really like them, and I love it. There's 2 yokai that I want to talk about a little bit more briefly because they don't exactly fit the definition of the concept I'm talking about here, but they're pretty close. The first one being Kyokotsu. This yokai is formed when someone's body or bones, instead of being given a nice, respectful burial around their loved ones, is chucked down a well. They could be a victim of murder, suicide, or an accident and fell down the well and that's how their body got down there. Or they could have died elsewhere and just got yeeted into the well afterwards. Either way, they're not happy that they're down there. This lack of a proper burial creates a vengeful spirit out of the corpse. Their bones will wait down at the bottom of that well until some unsuspecting passerby comes up to use it, and then they will float up to the top where they will appear as just some tattered clothing with a bleached skull and ratty hair. Like many vengeful spirits, anyone who looks upon or encounters a Kyokotsu will be cursed for the rest of their lives. The first appearance of this yokai was in Toriyama Sekien's book, Honjaku Yaki Shuri. Honjaku Yaki Shuri. It was published in the 1780s and is kind of a supernatural bestiary. And it is in this bestiary that we get some context for the name of Kyokotsu. There's a couple different translations and etymologies of the name, and one of them is Crazy Bones. Somehow I feel a kinship, but I also kind of think that that is what a wine aunt on Facebook would make her status after a bender. Maybe that says something about me. However, in Toriyama Sekien's book, it's stated that the name Kyokotsu actually translates to fury and violence. Somehow I still feel a kinship. Now there is kind of a similar word to that in a local dialect, but there's no exact translation to the word that he's talking about in the book. So we think that's kind of likely that he just made up that translation to make it more interesting. And I mean, hey, I get it. It worked. Also, all this stuff with the name led to my favorite thing about Kyokotsu, which is this little information block on the website that I did a lot of my research. Kyokotsu. Translation: crazy bones. Habitat: wells. Diet: none. It is powered solely by vengeance. I think I'm a Kyokotsu. Now our next yokai is a little bit less relatable in my opinion, but I don't know, maybe there's some freaks out there watching this. This one is the gruesome Kubikajiri. They can be seen wandering graveyards as the temperature drops and nights grow long during the autumn equinox. But unlike me wandering a graveyard during the autumn equinox, they're not hungering for the pumpkin-flavored donuts at Kroger. They're hungering for heads. If you happen to see one, they can make for a pretty disturbing sight, with long disheveled hair, sunken eyes, discolored skin, and a lack of legs, all adorned in a long white robe, as many ghosts are. But despite being a bit disturbing, you're probably not in any danger. Yet. Because these guys aren't after living heads, they only want the ones attached to corpses. So, while you aren't their prey right now, while you live and breathe, just wait, you will be. And they're known to be kind of messy eaters, so they'll really make a mess of blood, gore, and viscera of you. There's two main legends as to where these yokai come from and why they have their hankering for heads, one of which is that these were people that died and were buried without their head, meaning that not all of their body was buried together, making it an improper burial. And another legend says that perhaps these are the ghosts of elderly people who specifically died of starvation. This comes from an outdated practice where during times of famine or general economic strife, those who were elderly, sick, otherwise interred, were kind of just neglected in the interest of making less mouths to feed. This person's ghost will come back obviously resenting that death and is kind of out for vengeance. But they're surprisingly patient about it. They'll wait until whoever it was let them starve also dies, then they'll find that person's corpse and eat their head. I guess they're just playing the long con here. However, the real origin for this yokai is a painting done by Ibitsusai Buncho, a prolific painter in the mid to late 18th century, and a little different from his usual paintings of kabuki actors. This one depicts a ghost eating a man's head in a graveyard. From this, in my opinion, awesome painting, sparked this entire mythology. Now, like I said, these yokai are similar to what I'm talking about, but not exact, because the concept I'm really interested in exploring is specifically bones of people that somehow weren't properly buried or disrespected in their death, that are not only vengeful, but hungry. And this third yokai is exactly that. It's the 9th century, and Japan is experiencing some turmoil. An infamous samurai known as Taira no Masakado has been laying waste to the surrounding area with a bloody rebellion, but he has just been killed in battle. The imperial court declared that his entire family were all traitors to the country, and every single one of them had to be put to death. And most of them were, save for 2 of his young children, which escaped and survived. Yoshikado and Satsuki Hime both escaped to hide in a temple at the base of Mount Tsukuba, not Scuba. Satsuki Hime would become a nun, and her brother would continue exploring the mountain and playing samurai, as it said. There's various legends on what happened next, but one of them is that after a good amount of time had passed by, Yoshikado encountered a powerful wizard on the mountain. This wizard informed the siblings that they were the heirs to the powerful samurai Masakado, something that they had never been aware of before. And on top of that, the wizard gave him a scroll containing the secrets to frog magic. Frog magic! Do you have any idea what I would give for a mountain wizard to teach me the secrets of frog magic? I think it would fix every problem I've ever had in life. Yoshikado went home, told his sister everything that had happened, and he gave her maybe the most important scroll in the entire world. Satsuki Hime studied it and practiced and eventually became very skilled in the secret art of frog magic. Why can't that be me? And she actually took the name of Takeyashi, meaning Waterfall Demon Princess. I'm gonna be honest, I know she's kind of a villain, but I love her. Takeyashi Hime may be a nun and a samurai, but guess what? She's also a queen. Just absolute girl boss. Your fave could never. She and her brother Yoshikado decided that they would take up arms and continue their father's rebellion. To do this, they gathered what soldiers were still surviving and loyal, and Takeyashi Hime used some of her newfound magic. Along with their human soldiers, she also summoned an entire army of yokai and is said to have ridden into battle on a giant floating frog. But despite all this badassery, the siblings had a problem approaching. Unfortunately for them, a warrior named Oya no Taro Mitsukuni had heard about their plans. He tracked down their mountain base hideout and went to specifically try and defeat Takeyashi Hime, because he knew that she was the bigger threat. But when he got there, all he found was a beautiful young woman who was offering some services. This young woman tried to seduce him, but he was expecting a trap going into this, and so he quickly recognized this as Takeyashi Hime in disguise. In order to prove it, he recounted the graphic, brutal death of the samurai Masakado, and Takeyashi Hime, unable to contain herself, burst into tears and ran away. But that was not the last he would be seeing of her. Later that night, she ambushed Mitsukuni, along with an army she had summoned of yokai and skeletons. But he proved a noble adversary, more so than she had expected. The brave warrior wasn't shaken by the army of yokai and living dead, and he was able to hold his own. And so, Takeyashi Hime pulled out the big guns, or rather, the big boy. She summoned a yokai said to be as tall as a towering building and can be heard before it's seen, with the horrible sound of clattering bones and gnashing teeth. Gashadokoro. A giant skeleton that some say can be 10 meters tall, or about 33 feet. She had summoned it from the many bones of fallen soldiers that had been left to die on the battlefield. Their rage from war and dying alone far from home carried into the bones and grew into this giant monstrosity. It was a hard-fought battle against all these yokai and this one brave warrior, but that warrior has gone down in history for a reason, as he still came out on top. This legend that became popular in the Edo period is known as one of the first records of Gashadokoro, which, by the way, yes, is the final yokai that I'm talking about. There's even a woodblock print of the legend called Takeyashi the Witch and the Skeleton Spectre, done by Utagawa Kuniyoshi in 1843 to 1847. It depicts Takeyashi summoning the Gashadokoro against Mitsukuni and is known as one of the original visual references for the yokai. Now, in the legend of Takeyashi, Gashadokoro was summoned for a purpose by a person. But that's not usually how the myth of this yokai goes. Especially nowadays, Gashadokoro kind of just happens. Like in the story, one of the ways that it can form is through the many bodies of fallen soldiers all kind of coming together to form a much bigger body. But one can also be formed by the many bodies of victims of starvation, especially out in the wilderness. See, the main requirements here is that people die with some kind of pain, fear, rage in their hearts, and also, physical pain in their bodies, and that you need a lot of skeletons, like a lot of them, which there's only one way to get a lot of those: death. The pain that these people die with then kind of twists into a sort of grudge against the living, which is just compounded in on itself when all of the skeletons come together to form the building-sized one. Usually it's said that a Gashadokoro continues existing and maintains its form up until that pain and rage has subsided, and then it kind of just collapses into all of the bones that makes it up. And of course, a lot of that grudge against the living comes not only from the ways that these people died, usually pretty terribly, but also that they were never given a burial, having died out on a battlefield and left to rot, or died out in the forest somewhere, completely unknown. As for the name of this yokai, it's not really an actual word, so to speak, so you can't really directly translate it. It's more of an onomatopoeia, so it is a word that describes a sound, like boom, or pow, or meow. Though the sound that Gashado Goro is named after is used a little bit less often in comic books, quite unfortunately, as it is the sound of a rattling skull. The name also references the onomatopoeia of gashi gashi, which is the sound of gnashing and shattering teeth. Goat didn't like that. Coward. The yokai is of course named this because those are the sounds that it makes. Wandering the countrysides at night, if you should happen to hear such sounds, you should immediately hide. Another fun note from the website that I did a lot of my research from is that Gashado Goro's diet is listed as none, but enjoys eating humans anyway. So if you do actually hear the sounds of rattling bones and gnashing teeth in the middle of the night, you're actually one of the lucky ones. Because despite all of this, Gashado Goro has the ability to go entirely silent, and this is where its size comes as even more of an advantage. Contrary to what you might think, Gashado Goro is actually so big that it can blend in. Usually we think of giant beings as standing out, obviously, especially a 10-meter tall skeleton, but in the pitch blackness of the countryside, with all kinds of strange shapes of the landscape, morphed even further by fog and mist, even a gigantic skeleton can slip into obscurity. I think there's something very uniquely terrifying about that. The idea that there's something so big but entirely silent that you don't even know it's there. Just this huge building-sized thing looming over you, waiting to snatch you up and crush you. That's what they do, by the way, and then eat your head. It's just a very specific kind of existentially horrifying. So now that we've covered some of the more terrifying aspects of Hungry Bones, I want to end the episode by circling back to something we talked about at the beginning, with the Chinese tradition of being buried at home. There was the procession of the dead to get you back home to be buried, but what if not even that was enough? What if someone died overseas? In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in America. This made it illegal for Chinese people to become American citizens. This was due to anti-Chinese sentiment in America and fear that they would take white Americans' jobs. Yep. Until it was repealed in 1943, Chinese people in America were very much separated from their homeland. Before and after death, they could pay dues to a district company that would bury their body and wait for decomposition to occur, and then after a few months or even a few years, the body would be exhumed. Every single bone was counted to make sure that the whole body was together and accounted for. We know what can happen if you're buried incompletely, and put in an urn to be shipped back home to China and buried in a family plot. This was, of course, only if you could pay your dues to that district company, and who knows how much that was, and it obviously wasn't a perfect option for plenty of other reasons. One of them being that some of these people had been in America for so long that they didn't even know who their family was. They had come over as young boys and died unmarried, and they had no idea if they were even shipped home back to China, who would care for their ghosts? Or would they be left to be eternally gnawing on their own bones for nourishment that they could never get? And while it's a bit of a depressing note to end on, I do think that with all of these scary stories of what can happen if you aren't properly cared for after you die, there's another side to it. It's scary in kind of a different way, in a much more real way. While yes, these are stories that are specific to certain cultures, it ties into fears about death that circle throughout the entire world and go throughout time. This is something that I'll talk about more in the season finale, but there is a lot from around the world about just caring for the dead, both the physical body and the soul, whatever the soul may be in that culture. And I think it's something that helps to ease our fears about death and the grief of ones that we've lost. Knowing that there is some way that we can still care for them and ensure that they're still happy, or that there is some other being that is caring for them and ensuring that they're happy. And not to mention fears about ourselves. What happens after we die? How do our bodies change? What do we become? Will we be remembered, or will we fade into obscurity? Despite the very dark, heavy content of all of this, it is always nice when there's something that unites all of humanity throughout time and cultures. This is something that, in a way, we can all relate on if we just listen to each other and understand each other. And as with many myths about death and the afterlife, it also reminds us to live this life to the fullest that we can. And there's plenty of ways to do that, but it seems that from these stories, one of them is to just not go out by yourself at night, especially if you live in the rural countryside. So thank you for watching this episode of Morbid Mysteries and Histories. Remember to always listen up for the sound of chattering teeth and rattling bones. Tell me if you ever learned the secrets to frog magic. Always ask questions, and stay morbid.